Hello, everyone. I'm Mark Turner, the External Relations Director of SRM 360. Welcome to our live discussion on nature and how it might interact with sunlight reflection methods, also known as solar geoengineering or SRM. We'll be covering how people think about the natural world in the age of widespread human impacts and focusing on, in particular, on climate change and how SRM might protect, harm, or otherwise affect it. Our goal at SRM 360 is to support an informed discussion about SRM. We don't take a position on whether it should ever be deployed or not, but we do support its research and broad-based discussions. So one other thing to add, we published a perspective from several other experts on nature and SRM, which you can find on our website, and we encourage you to check it out afterwards. So we'll be fielding questions from the audience. Please ask them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, not the chat, but the Q&A option so we can keep track. And please keep your questions short and focused on the topic at hand. I'll direct some of those questions during the discussion and again at the end. So thank you again for coming. Hope you enjoy the discussion. And I'll now turn over to Pete, our editorial director.
Thank you, Mark. So I'm just waiting for some slides to begin. Great. So the natural world is a place of incredible beauty, with ecosystems that support a huge variety of life on land and in the oceans. But healthy ecosystems are not only valuable in their own right, they are also essential to supporting humankind, providing clean water and other essential ecosystem services like pollination. Today, humanity's impact on the natural world is undeniable, with land use shrinking habitats, fishing taking a heavy toll in the oceans, alongside mining, pollution, and other impacts. There are now few places left on the planet that could be counted as truly untouched by human activity. With climate change, a fundamentally global phenomena, one could argue that there aren't any such places left at all. With climate change, once stable conditions are now shifting rapidly, impacting ecosystems. This chart, for example, shows the date cherry blossoms bloomed in Kyoto over the past few hundred years. And what was once stable and predictable is now rapidly changing. In an age of deep and widespread human impacts, is there such a thing as the natural world, independent of humankind? And how should we think about it and efforts to protect and preserve it? In today's discussion, taking place on Earth Day, we'll cover what nature means to people, some of the ways humans have changed and continue to change the natural world, and the ways that solar geoengineering might change it further, for better or worse, if it were ever deployed. Joining us in today's discussion are three experts. We have Mark Lynas, science writer and author of 6 Degrees, Our Future on a Hotter Planet, which won the Royal Society's Science Book Prize. Mark is science advisor to the Climate Vulnerable Forum and policy lead at We Planet, an alliance of several environmental organizations. We are also joined by Mike Tidwell, founder of the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, a non-profit organization dedicated to fighting global warming. His book, The Lost Trees of Willow Avenue, was named one of the best non-fiction books of 2025 by Publishers Weekly. And we are joined by Arthur Obst, postdoctoral researcher at the University of Chicago, working next to me, and working on environmental philosophy and the ethics of climate intervention. He has published in leading journals such as Environmental Ethics, Moral Philosophy and Politics, as well as co-authoring the book Dialogues on Climate Justice. Before I turn to our panelists, I'd like to open with a question to our audience, which should appear shortly. Do you think solar geoengineering could help preserve nature and the natural world? No, maybe, yes, or unsure. We'll wait a little moment for the answers to filter in, and then we will show them. So let's see. All right, we have a fairly even distribution, more maybes and yeses than nos and unsures, though. All right, let's jump into the discussion. So, Arthur, how should we conceive of nature in today's world? What do we even mean by the word nature?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it's a really important question. That's why I'm excited about this panel, because from the very beginning of some of the proposals around climate intervention, and for instance, when Paul Crutzen wrote an influential article about this, that this idea, specifically in this proposal of the Anthropocene, this idea of that we in this new geological era of rampant impacts on the natural world from humans, And when he coined that word in a paper, he suggested that maybe geoengineering might be necessary. So there's something tempting about this idea that there's massive impacts on the natural world, and therefore we might need this kind of large-scale human intervention. And I think part of one notion of that distinct kind of inference might be that we now live, to quote Bill McKibben, after nature, at the end of nature, that because of all these impacts, nature no longer exists. The easiest way to make that claim is if we understand nature in a very pure way, and we understand nature to mean a non-human causal history. And if we mean that in a very pure way, and it means non-human causal history, then there is almost nothing, at least on the surface of the earth, which is not tied up in some way with limits. But you might understand nature more weakly if you lower the bar. There might still be a lot of nature. I also think that it's very helpful to think not just about nature in these contexts, but also what you might consider or call wildness, which can be separated conceptually, and I like to separate. Wildness as an idea separate from nature isn't necessarily having a non-human causal history, but that which is outside of human control. So that could be a negative notion of wildness, a quality of the non-human. But you can also understand maybe a positive quality of some animals, for instance, or maybe plants, that they can kind of express themselves in their own way. And this might have a relationship.
So just to interrupt there, can we just so the non-causal human history? Can you just explain a little bit about what you mean by these? I guess this effect of wildness on the world, or the effect of nature changing the world in its own way. Can you just elaborate on that point a little?
Yeah. So when it comes to the distinction here, just a helpful one, non-human, just said nature as non-human causal, which just means which is existing without humans causing it or creating it. If we understand that climate change seems to have impacted everywhere and our agency is mixed up with everything on Earth, and so that becomes unnatural because of that causal connection. But while you could imagine maybe thousands of years ago, you could imagine there were things that had never been interacted with humans at all, and so it was natural in that form of sense. But wildness, if it's something, and you can understand in different ways, but something that is outside of human control, arguably you could understand climate change as increasing at least that one certain kind of wildness that now the natural world is outside of our control. What is climate change other than something that is exceeding us that we did not anticipate and are not controlling? So this is a way of understanding that if why wildness could exist even in a world that is at least wrapped up in human affairs. And I could say more, but I'll leave it there for yeah.
Yeah, we'll come back to this. So, Mark, I ran through a list of human impacts on the natural world in my intro. But what are the biggest impacts humanity is having? What's the scale of the damage we're doing?
Thanks for that question, Pete. First, I'd just like to acknowledge that we're on a panel. I know that the hosts make great efforts to ensure diversity, gender diversity, and other forms of diversity on this on the panel. So I just wanted to not leave that unacknowledged, because I know that's something you put a lot of thought into. To deal with the topic in hand here, we don't live on a natural planet. We live on a planet which is being geoengineered by humans in multiple ways, and has been since the dawn of civilization. We are geoengineering our oceans. We are geoengineering our climate, of course. We are geoengineering our terrestrial surface with farming and multiple other impacts like urbanization and animal ranging and so on. So there is no true nature, no true wilderness really anywhere on the planet, not even at the bottom of the Mariana Trench or at the heart of the Amazon rainforest or in the middle of the Antarctic polar ice sheet. And I think once you acknowledge that, it puts a slightly different spin on this kind of question, because the implication is that we could somehow leave the planet to be natural and not intervene in specific ways, such as SRM. But the reality is that we are already in charge of the planetary thermostat in terms of the energy balance of the planet, how much heat it retains, how much gets lost to space, and how much is trapped in the Earth system. And the result of that, of course, has enormous impacts on nature. We know, and you've covered this at SRM 360, that there's clear tipping points, whether it's the Amazon rainforest or coral reefs or many other ecosystems which are heat related. And if we don't intervene directly to protect them, then we're leaving them essentially to their fate as the planet's temperature continues to increase, because the least likely outcome of all of this is that we're going to suddenly cut back greenhouse gas emissions and get to net zero within the space of 15 years and somehow stabilize the planetary temperature that way. So we're in an age of direct interventions. We at least have the scientific planetary understanding and hopefully intelligence to be able to craft thoughtful and effective responses to this. But doing nothing is absolutely the worst option of all.
I just want to pick up something there. So you use the term geoengineering in a very broad way. Basically, all our interventions that change the Earth in some fashion, you sort of, I guess, classified as geoengineering. Do you not see a distinction between this kind of global scale of the intervention that's associated with solar geoengineering, as opposed to, say, channeling a river? What's your think about the scale here?
No, I don't. And if we look at, say, albedo modification, that's a clear example of this. Controlling sulfates in shipping has already had an effect on global temperature, even if it's something that's done ship by ship or only across a single transport sector. So, in what way is that not geoengineering? And I think putting a boundary around what is and isn't geoengineering and making the former somehow a more complicated, more controversial topic isn't helpful. The fact is that we're changing the reflectivity of the planet to look at just one source of energy imbalance, and we're doing that in lots of distinct ways. And we understand those, and we can choose to push them in a negative or in a positive direction. If we choose to call some of them geoengineering and not others, then I don't think that particularly helps the conversation. I know that's something that you put a lot of thought and time into, but I think it's an important point to make because if you rule out certain interventions simply because they are large scale, then you mean that we can't, then that means that we can't have an impact at the planetary level in terms of actually achieving a positive outcome.
Thanks. Well, from the planetary to the local, Mike, in your recent book, The Lost Trees of Willow Avenue, you write about climate change's impact on nature that can be seen at the sort of neighborhood scale. How important is that local perspective for understanding these issues and what lessons did you draw from thinking that way?
Yeah, thanks, Pete. Yes, climate change. The point I tried to make in my book, The Lost Trees of Willow Avenue, is that we're feeling the impacts of climate change now everywhere. The warming has gotten so advanced that, uh, the presumption even 20 or 30 years ago that to see global warming up close, scientists and journalists really had to go to the Arctic or the Great Barrier Reef. Fast forward to the early 2020s, and it is everywhere. And to prove that observation, I just paid attention to my one block, my one street right on the border of Washington, D.C. in Maryland, a 100-year-old old trolley neighborhood, a suburb of D.C., and observed the impacts for a year. And basically the number one signature of climate change in my neighborhood is our biggest oak trees are dying. And it's not me saying it's climate change that's causing it. It's the city arborists, it's the public works folks, it's the tree experts who come out and diagnose these trees and ultimately cut them down who are saying it's extreme weather linked to climate change. And so I decided to explore that and try to explain how climate change is killing our big trees, and not just here, but around the world. The iconic cedars of Lebanon are burning up. The iconic stone pines of Rome are dying from insect attacks linked to climate change. The bristlecone pines of the American West are dying of thirst through epic drought. My book, I try to reveal that nature, what we like to believe is nature, even in our backyards, is now suffering from excessive warming, and I explore it further quantify the amount of Lyme disease in my one neighborhood. I have suffered from chronic Lyme disease for years, misdiagnosed from a tick bite. We know our milder winters in North America are allowing more and more ticks to survive the winters. Wetter conditions are favorable to ticks. Also, I read about flooding and the cascading impacts of climate change on this one street where excessive rain is killing our old oak trees. When they disappear, of course, there's nothing better to control flooding than big trees with the roots that absorb the water, the canopies that slow down the rainfall. So we have these cascading impacts of climate change on one block. And if that's the case, then, I hope that the story brings home for the reader that this really has a situation that's come home to roost, that you could throw a dart at a spinning globe now, and wherever that dart lands, whether it's the downtown Tokyo or the highlands of Ethiopia or the 7100 block of Willow Avenue where I live, you can now write a whole book about the impacts on nature and people in these small microdots. And what really got me to write the book was when an arborist in the fall of 2022 told me, Mike, our native trees in the mid-Atlantic are no longer native. We've changed the climate, therefore they are foreigners. They are foreigners now, and they're getting sick and dying, and we should not be surprised about that. And that's when I began an exploration of what could be a plan B when global warming is this advanced. And I explore the idea that absent these big trees that shade our neighborhoods, is there a way to have a solar shade in the stratosphere? And I just explored those themes throughout the book.
Great. Well, we'll come back to solar geoengineering a bit, well, a lot more later. But I just want to turn back to Arthur here again to think about the value of nature, because I think there's a whole different range of values invoked here. And I guess, yeah, what are your thoughts on how we value nature as we think about our interactions with it?
Yeah. So I won't be able to capture all of them. I think you named even in the opening introduction, some highlighted some of the values. So aesthetic will matter a lot to people. If you're talking about natural as in other than human beings, the intrinsic value, so the sorts of value they have in and of themselves, whether that's sentient beings, it's very easy for a lot of people to understand, just like your dog might have moral value because it's a being that can suffer, that all wild animals might also have that. At least sentient animals might have that sorts of value. But then we also might imagine ecosystems as natural communities. Maybe they have a type of value, not unlike our own human communities, and that their integrity and stability matters as well. And that can be for a lot of reasons. I'm not going to be able to cover in full. I wanted to, though, to linger on something that I've, written and thought a lot about recently, though, about why wildness might matter morally and why it might have value. And again, I'm understanding wildness not in the sense of the untouched, nature, especially the kind that was just talked about, but rather in that which is outside of ourselves and that which is outside of our control. And this matters. The wilderness movement, which was also alluded to, really was, in my opinion, its beating heart was about recognizing the ways in which wildness might be valuable insofar as it can teach us things. It is beyond ourselves, and so we might learn from it. This both might teach us what we don't understand. So it teaches us a kind of ecological humility that we might not be able to control the wild nature, even if we tried. But it also might teach us what it means, how to be better people and better morally speaking, right? And so these are values, I think, that are at the heart of a lot of environmentalist traditions and even the wilderness tradition. And I think that's why I just wanted to close by just pushing back a little bit against that we are already geoengineering everything, right? Because this is kind of, I very much agree with you, Pete, that we need to distinguish between geoengineering and this notion of engineering, which requires a tight connection between intention and outcome. It's a controlling notion. And what is happening around the world, which is very much not bound to human control. It's very much outside of ourselves in ways that are causing a lot of harm, but are certainly, I don't think, can be described as engineering, especially at a global scale. There can be more local scale interventions that we've been doing a long time, like with river channeling, which is a more kind of straightforward notion of engineering. But I think this matters because if you understand everything we're doing as geoengineering, it serves to extinguish the wildness that exists and seems to say, this is kind of the inference that was just made, that there is no alternative but to intervening control. But that's not true, right? There is an alternative, and it's a choice we're making. And we can debate about whether that's a wise choice or not, but it's a choice we can make. And a lot of environmentalists would say control as humans, this need for control is a big root of the cause, which has resulted in the climate catastrophe in the first place. And so this might I think we should at least, if we're going to be open to that diagnosis, we have to preserve this distinction between geoengineering and other forms of interference and harm to the environment.
I just want to give, if I could just jump in one last thing for Mark before I turn back to the other Mark. So Mark, I mean, is there is this our kind of wildness and engineering or intended intervention, are they truly at odds or can they be reconciled to some extent before we move on to specifics of solar geoengineering?
Yeah, I don't particularly disagree with Arthur. I think the issue is intentionality. So yes, we are engineering or geoengineering the planet, and we're doing so inadvertently in that we've shifted the planet's energy balance such that it's gaining heat and doing so increasingly rapidly. Um, the oddly, the intentionality is everything, and you can see this in human legal systems and in our psychology and in our ethics. Of course, there's a big difference between murder and manslaughter. Even if somebody gets killed, there's still a dead person at the end of it, right? But it is very different, and I think that's what really troubles people is the idea that not only that humans take control, but that some other human takes control and it's not you. Or there has to be some collective process to determine who takes control. And with regards to geoengineering, that's of course the root of all of the conspiracy theories about chemtrails. Some evil billionaire is doing something to you which is affecting your health or your children's health or whatever it happens to be. These narratives are always constructed in a particular way, which makes them particularly appealing to suspicious human psychology. So I don't dispute that there is this difference, but the reality is the reality. We are engineering the planet inadvertently such that we are gaining however many watts it is per square meter, and that's affecting all of the planet's ecosystems, including the wild ones and the ones that are the most wild of all, which are being increasingly harmed by the change in temperatures. Coral reefs are a good example. We could intentionally engineer coral reefs at a genetic level, let's say. We could accelerate their evolution so that they become more thermally tolerant, and we could try and reseed them at a small scale. It was difficult to imagine doing this over tens of thousands of square kilometers, which you'd need to do with coral reefs. I know you've covered the subject as well. Or we could just cool down the ocean sufficiently with the planetary sunshade so that coral reefs are still within their thermal tolerance threshold, their envelope of enabling them to survive in a wild way. Which of those is more wild in your it's all about the ethics and the psychology of this. The reality on the ground in terms of how ecosystems and organisms experience it actually isn't any different between those two options.
I've got a couple of questions from the audience. I've actually also got a question myself. I'm going to split them into, though, when we get into the specifics of solar geoengineering, I'll ask those questions in the second half. But one just initial question from Holly Olivares asks, directed to Arthur, why do you not describe humans as nature? And then, and obviously anybody else who would like to answer that would be great. And I just have one additional one of my own. You outlined a number of the sort of intangible, aesthetic, intrinsic value of nature. When people come to make assessments about interventions or not, and the cost and the benefit, is there any way of measuring that? Do we have any way in which we could put things into some kind of balance, or does it all come down to narrative power? Thank you.
Yeah, so I can speak to both of those. So humans are natural. So answer the first question, right? But nature is, and maybe I should have led with this, it's famously an ambiguous term, and so it can mean different things. And so the question is a kind of just a stipulation of nature to not just meaning everything that is not supernatural, but specifically a non-human category. Does that have any value? And I think it does, and partly to what I was describing before, at least as the value of, not wild nature, from this kind of teaching the sorts of creature that a human is, what the way the rest of the ecological world lives and resides and functions. So if we say that we're all the same, we're all homogenous in this way, we just tie us all under one category, I think this disguises maybe some of the reasons that some of the things that we can learn from the very different beings that exist in the world. So that's why I think it's helpful to make that. But the way I like to think of wildness, for instance, is just the freedom of the non-human. But you could just use one word to describe that: freedom. Freedom of humans to exist as we are, freedom of non-humans to exist as we are. And you don't need to make, this is in some ways just a a distinction we use for convenience, but not because it necessarily describes some, or even does describe some absolute reality out in the world. On the second point, there are various ways to try to measure some of these spiritual significance. You can try to kind of quantify different matrices of maybe flourishing of certain human communities. There's different attempts to do that. That also tries to factor in the kind of non-human contributions to that flourishing. And but I do think, one remark I would just make and as for myself, is that I do think, there is also a danger in thinking the only thing of value and that should count politically is that which can be measured. And it's impossible, right? I mean, one a thought experiment, an ethicist would say is, can you put a dollar value on your mother, your relationship with your mother? Some might think that actually inherently cheapens the very the sort of relationship it is by putting a number on it. And so maybe this can be represented. Certainly, ecosystem services, that is an approach that people use, and it can be a very good one to try to capture the value of non-human nature. But I don't think it should be taken to supplant or to replace that kind of a more narrative or qualitative notion of value.
Great, thank you. I don't know if Mike or Mark would like to jump in on either of those before we move on to the more SRM focused. Mark, please go ahead.
Yeah, on quantification, I mean, you need quantification in order to have empiricism, and that's at the heart of science, really, and understanding the world. But it's also not everything. Putting numbers on things enables you to rank them in terms of orders of priority and such like. But again, that's also not everything. I'm involved in a campaign at the moment to try and stop krill fishing in the Southern Ocean off Antarctica. And the trawler companies who defend krill fishing say, well, it's only 1% of the biomass, and it's the most sustainable fishery in the world. And at the same time, you see these huge super trawlers that go in the middle of pods of whales and just eat the food out from underneath them. And krill is the heart of the ecosystem in the Antarctic, and so it's not even if they were right that the science supports that krill was a sustainable fishery, which actually I don't think it does, but even if it did, I would still be against it because somehow that's invading the heart of something sacred, which needs to be left wild, actually, and or at least left to recover from the depredations that humans have imposed on it in the past in industrial whaling. And I'll give you another example from Antarctica. There's probably lots of useful critical minerals in the transantarctic mountains, and we could go in there and dig up a few million tons of them and violate the idea that Antarctica should be a reserve, sacred and separate from direct human intervention, industrial intervention. And actually, that would probably have less ecological impact than digging them out of the Sumatran rainforest or wherever. You'd kill fewer trees and species and so on. But at the same time, it is a violation of sacredness to do that to Antarctica, and that somehow is meaningful in a different kind of way that I think it would be impossible to quantify. But actually, the spirit of it hits you in the heart. It's actually much more important than anything you could put numbers on. And I think this is why narrative is so powerful, because it's how we understand the world. It's not just how we put numbers on it and try and quantify it.
Yeah, and I would just jump in and say the value of ecosystem services is becoming increasingly apparent to even small neighborhoods like mine as global warming progresses. I mean, the cost of Lyme disease, because we have a population of ticks that's wildly greater than accelerated global warming, is costing. It's cost my household $10,000 in medical bills, and you can go on and on with other people. The cost of flooding. In my book, The Lost Trees of Willow Avenue, I detail how lost canopy trees, disappearing canopy trees, the big ones, combined with larger rainstorms, are flooding buildings everywhere, including my Presbyterian church a block from my house, where the city of Tacoma Park, Maryland, had to spend $45,000 elevating a sidewalk, not because the sidewalk needed fixing. It was a perfectly good sidewalk. They elevated it to create a flood levee to keep rainwater and flooding out of the preschool in the basement of my church. So these are ecosystem services that all infrastructure all over the world was built for a climate that we no longer have. And now, as that climate changes, those infrastructures, whether they be healthcare infrastructure, flooding infrastructure, are all being scrambled, and it's very expensive. And that's one way you could measure the value of nature or these natural systems is by how much we're having to pay as they disappear.
Great, thanks. So time is ticking along here, so I'm going to skip forward a few questions and turn back to you again, Mike. How does the fact that solar geoengineering would be a deliberate human intervention to protect nature change how we should see it? Presuming it could help, would the very fact of intervening somehow make nature less natural? And should
I
that factor
mean,
into our thinking?
yeah, I'll answer that in 60 seconds. Yeah, that's a tough one. Um, I, I, it's hard to provide an answer to that other than to say that natural systems are of great value to us, as I write about in my book. And it's not just the infrastructure of roads and bridges, et cetera. It's also and Mark Lynas alluded to this earlier, the great spiritual value that comes from nature. Just in my neighborhood, these really big canopy trees that were here 5, 6, 7 years ago are now gone. We know this concept of forest bathing. When you're around big trees, your stress levels go down, your cortisol levels drop, your immune systems are boosted. And th That comes from this natural pre-climate change relationship between human beings and trees that is disappearing. So I think that our uh, to preserve ourselves, we need to preserve these natural systems. And if doing that by imitating Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines and injecting sulfur into the stratosphere cools the planet, cools the oceans, preserves the coral reefs, and allows magnificent trees and all their ecosystem services to survive, I think there's a compelling a moral case for that, but it has to be preceded, as we all know, by exhaustive study, decision-making processes internationally. But I think the strong argument can be made that that preserving these natural systems, if it's in our power to do so, is one that we have to really look at. And I explore that in my book and feel like most people, when presented with the circumstances and the moral questions, are open to exploring that question further.
Great, thanks. So I think we've talked quite a bit about the general idea of solar geoengineering as we've been discussing its background on climate change and the ways we're impacting the natural world. But I'm going to give a bit more background on two specific ideas. There is stratospheric aerosol injection, which Mike was just alluding to there, which would sort of mimic the cooling effect of major volcanic eruptions like Pinatubo by creating a layer of reflective particles in the upper atmosphere. It looks like this is quite feasible with the high-flying jets. And by reflecting only about 1% of incoming sunlight, you could do enough cooling to prevent the next 1 Celsius of global warming. So a big potential with this idea, though lots of questions remain about its consequences. And the other idea, which I think has got the sort of second most attention in the field, is marine cloud brightening, shown here on the right. This is a proposal to increase the reflectivity of marine clouds by spraying up sea salt from the ocean surface. There are several large technical challenges around that idea. Can we create the right kind of sea spray, and how will the clouds respond? But it's another promising idea. I guess a point here, thinking about naturalness, when the public is asked about these two ideas, they seem a lot less concerned by marine cloud brightening, perhaps because it sounds more natural, and it's often presented that way. But personally, I find it potentially quite a lot more troubling than stratospheric aerosol injection because the patchy nature of its cooling, because it is a local intervention that you could scale up, could produce quite large shifts in climate that could be quite disruptive. So Mark, how should we think about the naturalness of these ideas, or how natural they sound? How should that factor into our thinking? Or should we dismiss that and focus on the numbers?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say you should dismiss it, no, because I think the naturalness is at the heart of it, and I think the people who oppose SAI or SRM, whatever you want to call it, do so from an entirely ethical basis, in the sense that it's their belief system that's being threatened by this proposal, and I think I agree with them to some extent. See the planet as a sacred being, which direct human intervention would somehow would destabilize or would be a violation of, let's put it that way, a violation of the sacred. Um, my response to that would be that that you could think of it a different way, and it could be a protection of the sacred. I remember back in the old days when I was involved with Earth First, we had a slogan which was "No compromise in defense of Mother Earth," and I could use that slogan to defend the use of SRM. That we would be protecting Mother Earth from overheating, from the impacts of previous thoughtless human activities over the last century and a half by deploying this. And looking at your marine cloud brightening thing, I think the reason people are less scared by it is because it's local and it goes away after a few hours or something, and so people think, well, okay, that's less than doing something at the whole planetary level, so it seems a bit less scary. Um, I mean, I might propose that we simply simply reverse the negative geoengineering that we've done so far. So let's put the sulfur back into shipping fuels, and yes, a few people would die from pollution, but maybe that's better than the amount of extra energy that the Earth's capturing for having reduced it in the first place. All right, it's a conversation. It's a conversation which involves ethics, but that was done thoughtlessly. There wasn't any consideration of the energy balance aspects of removing sulfates from shipping fuels or from coal for that matter, coal-fired power stations for that matter. But there should have been. And now we know better. We maybe need to go back and reverse them. If we don't, then maybe we need to put the reflectivity back in a different way. And so I think you can. It depends how you construct these conversations really about what people's responses are going to be.
Yeah. So, Arthur, you wrote recently about the conservationist philosopher Aldo Leopold and what he might have thought about SRM. You concluded that he would view it with deep distrust and distress, and that we all should as well. Well, first, can you explain who is Aldo Leopold and why should we care what he thinks? And why did you agree with him? And why do you think he'd think this on SRM?
Great. Yeah. So Aldo Leopold is he was a very influential. So he was born in the late late 19th century, lived until 1948, I believe, or 49. And he was in. Why we should care about what he thinks is that he was a very early and influential ecologist, for one thing. He was an innovator in ecological restoration, especially wetland restoration. Um, he created or was most responsible for the first wilderness area that was in the Gila Wilderness in Mexico. He had a lot of policy importance, and he had a lot of during his lifetime a lot of significance for the field of ecology and wildlife management. But after his death, in some ways, in many ways, his reputation far exceeded what it had during his lifetime. When his book, A Sand Colony Almanac, which was published actually right after his death, um, where was really caught on in the early environmental movement. In fact, with the connection to Earth Day, it was the original Earth Day that really set off Aldo Leopold's popularity. And this, in the kind of the early environmental movement, this book, which was a kind of meditation, a spiritual and ecological human meditation of a connection to a landscape in Wisconsin, but also with an upshot that was really thinking about what sort of land ethic we should have. So the second part of the question is, well, that's my pitch about why you should care about Aldo Leopold. But then what might he think, or what should we think if we take his perspective seriously? In that paper, I'll only be able to kind of briefly describe the perspective, like the argument here. But I ask if we really cared about the wild creatures around us and thought that we should be plain members and inhabitants of the natural community, that is what Aldo Leopold called for in his land ethic. How should we take this proposal? Specifically, stratospheric aerosol injection is what I was most focused on. And on the one hand, I don't think we can rule it out entirely, or just on the face of it, because if the best case that could be made for it from an ecological perspective would be to think of it as a global scale and exercise in ecosystem restoration. So if we think about in a normal, restoration context, which is a common environmental intervention, even though it might reduce some, it might control and inhibit wildness or nature over here, it seems to like encourage general processes and natural processes that in the end actually might help that natural community. Maybe you could make that sort of case for engineering the entire climate, that animals, wild nature, ecosystems will live better under an engineered climate. This is kind of what I think Lynas was talking about, than they might otherwise. Why I'm concerned kind of alludes to what I was describing before as this kind of ecological and moral humility dimensions. And I think we're at the heart of wilderness as a kind of moral instinct and Elder Leopold's vision. So I quickly sketched what I call the climate engineer's dilemma in that paper, where, just to put it very briefly, I think there's a tension here where the more there's a lot of ecological questions, and that's really understudied, and we don't have a full grip at all on what sorts of ecological impacts a planetary intervention like stratospheric aerosol injection would have. But so that is one reason. If until we understand that, we shouldn't do it because it would be unpredictable and we wouldn't know what would follow. Right? That seems like a good case for not deploying for not doing this sort of technique. But then let's imagine that we got really good at it, and it turned that we could really fine tune, like as Linus described, this global thermostat, where it was truly like a thermostat in which we could change, we could put our proverbial hand on this thermostat and change the climate as we like. Maybe we would have really even localized control. This may not be possible at all, by the way. And to be very clear, this is not possible right now, and it may never be. But that would, in some ways, mean that there's no reason from ecological humility to not do this because we have full control. Even in that case, you might worry that this is still a brazen act of engineering from a more moral perspective, from a moral arrogance. Who has the moral competence to make these decisions, right? And I think I think there's this tension that the better we get at this, the more like morally arrogant it starts to appear. And then the worse we are at it, the more ecologically arrogant. So it's kind of like we don't really want this to work or not. And I think it at least poses a challenge for this enterprise in that there's not really a great outcome here. At best, it's always the best case that can be made for it is that it's better than the alternative of runaway global warming, right? That's always going to be the alternative. But I think it's a very fraught endeavor. And the better we get, that's gonna cause a lot of political and ethical questions itself that we're not ready to address, in my view.
Yeah, Mike, how are you thinking about that tension that Arthur just highlighted there between obviously stepping in and intervening into a system you don't understand or with impacts you don't understand and having a full understanding and gripping it entirely somehow makes us lose something. What are your reactions to that?
Well, first, I had a professor in college who said never assume what a past great thinker would think about a current situation. So, in terms of Aldo Leopold, one of the reasons he uh, was such an impressive thinker is that he was original and he was surprising compared to his contemporaries and his thoughts about nature. So, highly original thinkers of the past would probably surprise us in their response to current situations. So I don't know where Leopold will fall on this debate. I do know that in June of 2023, the White House Office of Science and Technology, at the request of Congress, issued sort of ethical guidelines for the research of SRM research, and especially in terms of sulfur. And they sort of posed the question in this paper, is geoengineering risky? Is this conversation risky? And the answer, of course, is yes. But risky compared to what? As Arthur said, compared to runaway climate change, then that changes the nature of the conversation. So the Biden administration, Office of Science and Technology, encouraged researchers and policymakers to take a risk versus risk management approach to this question. And I think that is where the ethical debate is centered. And as every day goes on and we see these profound impacts to human and natural communities, the urgency to weigh those risks becomes greater. And I think the argument for at least researching these possible techniques becomes stronger.
Yeah. So, Mark, your 2011 book, The God Species, you wrote about the need to play God at a planetary level. But what's your reaction to the point Arthur raised here? This kind of, I guess, there's a hubris of thinking we could know enough, and a hubris of thinking we have the ethical judgment to make these kind of interventions. What's your reaction to that as we sort of wrap up here and get on to questions from the audience?
Well, the opposite of hubris is probably false humility, which I think is an even worse position to take, where you just step back and say, "Hey, we'll let nature take its course," and of course, that may end up somewhere even worse than you were previously thinking. And to go back to the previous point, the riskiest position of all might be just to prefer ignorance and to say, well, we might have runaway global warming, we might turn into Venus, and let's not even gain the knowledge and the understanding of how we would prevent that were we to need to do so. So the God Species book, by the way, this was taken from Stuart Brand's epithet. We are as gods and might as well get good at it, I think he said. And that acknowledges that we are having a planetary impact. And I base the analysis around the planetary boundaries concept, which was at that time novel. It had just been published in Nature in 2009. And if you look at all of the different planetary boundaries, whether it's climate, biodiversity, the nitrogen cycle, water, land use, and so on, human impacts were affecting all of them. So the entire Earth system, yes, it's irreducibly complex and we can never really understand it. However good our models get at reproducing it sort of digitally in the mind of a computer, we can't ever really predict what the outcome of prodding it a certain way will be in the real world. But at least it's better because you don't have multiple planets to experiment with. At least it's better than nothing. You can get some kind of an insight. So I think the hubris thing is a moral argument, but it has no practical validity because it simply denies the agency that we in fact already have.
Great. Well, I guess if any last thoughts from people, and then if not, we can move to Q&A. Oh, Arthur, you want to get a last thought in?
I think one thing, I want to avoid is the perception that, right, any someone coming from my perspective would think that we should do nothing. Of course, that's not what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting we do a lot of things that we maybe not involve at least a lot of emphasis and a lot of funding into this proposal. So decarbonization, of course, it would be the most obvious one, adaptation, all these other sorts of measures. I also just wanted to, one of the kind of empirical factors I think why I think from a Leopoldian outlook, it's a troubling proposal on stratosphere gas and structures troubling as a way of helping biodiversity is, at least at the moment, biodiversity is not being destroyed primarily from climate change. It is being by a vast majority, it's being destroyed due to land use change, so just mostly habitat destruction and direct exploitation, right? It's just hunting pressures, for instance. And so solar geoengineering would not solve any of these primary drivers. And so I think, from that outlook, like what should we be doing if we want to truly help these communities? It's focusing on those things, reducing habitat destruction and reducing direct exploitation. I think that's everything. We all agree about that. But I just think until we have the moral competence to do that, I at least I think it's morally arrogant, and that's why I disagree. I think it can get traction. Whereas this is ongoing, I think it's presumptive to think that we'll do better by this engineering technique, which would have a lot of different and potentially unknowable outcomes. So I just wanted to say that in closing.
Great. Well, if we could, we've got quite a lot of questions, really great ones from the audience. I guess I could sort of split some of them into a number of technical questions about how SRM would affect some specific biomes and so forth. And maybe we'll have some time to get more into those at the end. I'll just note that we will end on the hour, but we're going to have, up to about 50 minutes at the end in case anybody else can stay on to answer a couple more of the questions. But one set of questions I've got here, I guess I would broadly put into the question of governance. I think probably speaking to questions of, you asked who has the moral competence, Arthur. But I will note one comment from John Moore basically noting that our panelists are currently all from, the global north. There may be some very different perspectives from the global south about how to make these considerations, and I'm noticing that Harrison Kavisu Mbungu, a journalist from Kenya, is asking who governs solar geoengineering, where's the frameworks for governing it, some other questions here, who might have the dominant decision-making process. Perhaps I'll turn over to Mark on this one. Putting these sort of questions that we're dealing with today and esteemed experts, but how in practice, where in practice, and what fora would the world go about making these assessments?
Well, it's absolutely true. We don't have the global south represented on this panel, I guess, but who represents the global south as an entity anyway? I mean, nobody by definition. So everyone represents all their multiple different perspectives, and I think we need to not just split into binary categories like that anyway. Um, Actually, I wouldn't claim to represent the Global South, but I do to some extent advise the Global South through the Climate Vulnerable Forum, to which I'm science advisor. And that's an intergovernmental group of 74 developing countries, all in the Global South, obviously. And for them, climate vulnerability is defined not so much geographically, although to some extent it is with small island states, let's say, and so on. But it's a socioeconomic categorization that these countries don't have the capacity to withstand the kind of climate shocks which are now hitting them. And on the SRM debate, my position in advising them is that they need to have the best information and the best knowledge to take a position in their own interests, whatever the interests of their countries might be, as they determine them, but through scientific understanding of what SRM might mean. And if you're, and I'm speculating here, but if you're a coral atoll nation like Tuvalu or the Maldives, which faces extinction from rising sea levels at some point, it may not be in the next decade, but it's likely to be this century if the polar ice sheets continue to disappear at their current rate, then your position might be quite pro an intervention which is going to cool the planet and slow the rate of sea level rise. But that might be very different from the position of a delegate from Russia who feels it's still too cold in Siberia or whatever it happens to be. And so there will be always huge disagreement. And I'm not trying to oversimplify this in terms of what the planetary average temperature should be. It's not the question isn't so much the practical mechanics of how we get there, but who gets to decide. And I guess to some extent we have got some track record here. The collective humanity, represented by virtually all nations on Earth, decided that we should not go beyond 1.5 or at the very worst 2 degrees at the Paris Agreement. And that is effectively a decision on what the planetary average temperature should be. But is that to say that the only way we should reach that objective is through restraining carbon emissions and methane and one or two other things, or that we should be able to intervene directly in the albedo of the planet and the resulting energy balance? So I think the parameters of this debate actually are got wrong a lot in terms of how it's constructed and understood.
Thank you. Mike, we've got one question here from Jake Schwartz. Interesting to kind of think about what groups have traditionally supported or opposed geoengineering research in terms of and the framings which might make them think about it in ways that they care about. What aspects of sort of thinking about SRM and nature and protection, to what extent can that bring traditional conservation groups into this debate to support potentially or consider or get involved in a topic that they might otherwise not really have wanted much to do with?
Yeah, great question. I mean, my group, the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, we were founded in 2002 as a sort of hard-charging, left-of-center grassroots advocates for clean energy solutions to global warming in Maryland, Virginia, and DC. So we occupy and surround the nation's capital. And it was all for 20 years about mitigation, about fighting new fossil fuel infrastructure, passing laws at the state level mandating greater solar and wind and battery development. And we've had some successes, but in the process, after all that work and all those laws passed, the slowness, we're going in the right direction, but at the wrong speed. And it caused us as a group that maybe surprises a lot of other environmental groups to seriously look at this idea of SRM research. And as we came out and were very public about this in a webinar with our 50,000 members across the region and to our funders and donors, we were shocked, honestly, by the almost complete lack of backlash, that we were met mostly with curiosity and requests for deep conversations over this. We've had a number of gatherings where we've brought other NGOs from across the United States together to discuss the issue. And it's not just us now that's out in that field. You've got some of the big national groups, Environmental Defense Fund, NRDC, even Sierra Club has shown some curiosity toward this. And then at the local and regional level, we've got groups from the American South to the upper Midwest to New England, the American Southwest, all of them experiencing the kind of shocking climate impacts that we've seen in the Mid-Atlantic and leading them into this conversation around geoengineering research that, frankly, none of us even 5 or 10 years ago thought we would be here, but we are. And I just think that the conversation is becoming normalized, which I think is a healthy thing. We do need to learn more. And ignorance, as Mark Lynas has said, I mean, inaction through ignorance is probably the worst outcome. And we've been encouraged by the openness to this conversation, even at the grassroots level.
That's very interesting to hear. So it'd be interesting to see how that framing develops. I'm going to have one last question on this section of questions before handing over to Pete. But after the formal close, we'll dive into some of the more technical questions, perhaps, if we have time. I just one quick one. Perhaps I'll ask you to Arthur. Ask Arthur. Again, it's on an intangible, and a sense of what it is to be in nature. So SAI would not perceptibly or very limited, and we're going to have an article on this soon, affect the appearance of the sky. However, what would it look like, feel like, to look at the sky and to think, wow, there's been some stratospheric aerosol injection up there? Does that change our relationship to nature? How important that sort of feeling of something has changed? And is that different to what we already see in the sky with CO2 emissions and so forth? Have you any thoughts on that, Arthur?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to vary.
Oh, it appears that we've lost Arthur.
About how SAI might. Oh, sorry, did I?
You froze for a second there.
Okay, I think it might be okay now. Sorry about that. It's going to vary from person to person. For me, I think what matters, like when it comes to the climate change versus stratospheric aerosol injection sorts of scenario, where it's true that climate change itself changes what it means to be in the outdoors for a lot of people. I mean, Bill McKibben's original book, The End of Nature, I think was in many respects an existential reflection on just what does it mean to even think about nature. But how does nature's value exist or change in a world of global warming? And I think that had a lot of existential significance for him. And I think it did for a lot of people. For other people, it might not, there was a lot of responses to Bill McKibben that said, well, yeah, but there's still wildness and clearly, this is just like kind of tainting it a little bit. So maybe it doesn't matter so much. And I actually have more of that reaction because I care more about wildness, and that is not going anywhere anytime soon. So for me, I think the question, it really depends on what sort of stratospheric aerosol injection is happening. And if it's a tiny intervention, if I'm imagining just a little bit, that I might react differently than, and if it's a democratically, if nations come together and decide this together, that to me, and it's been well studied, that would probably mean less to me than if it were just a single large intervention from a single country.
Thank you. We're on the hour, so I'm going to have to formally wrap this up. But just a reminder, we're going to continue. If any of the guests can stay on for a second longer afterwards, please check us out on our website, our social media, sign up for our newsletter and all that good stuff. Pete, did you want to end on the follow-up survey, or should we dive into the continuation of the question?
Yeah, well, I'll just thank our panel, Mark Lynas, Mike Tidwell, and Arthur Obst, who've been fantastic, and hope they've all got a few extra minutes as we end this section and move on to some additional questions.
So a packet of technical questions, which we received both before and during the thing around animals, and I suppose wilderness more broadly. But how would, and maybe you asked this on a more technical level, Pete, but how would solar geoengineering impact on wild animals? I'll add a couple of more questions in this bucket. Does solar geoengineering promote or harm wilderness, and why? What is known at this point about the ecological impacts of SRM? I mean, this is a big question. We're going to have to deal with it in other sessions, but is there a top line answer to that you can give at this stage?
Sorry, just want to jump in to say I unfortunately have a hard stop right
Okay.
now. So I'm going to duck out. Amazing conversation. Honored to be part of it. Sorry I can't stay for the after party, but thanks again to all of you.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Mike. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess one kind of overarching concept there is in understanding the impacts of climate change on ecosystems and species is the climate niche or the ecosystem niche. Species and ecosystems exist within a certain range of conditions, a certain temperature range, a certain amount of rainfall, and so on. And as the planet warms, those conditions that they're familiar with shift. There tends to be a shift of warmer condition or the conditions they're used to temperature-wise shifting towards the poles disappearing at the poles and new conditions being created across the tropics. So we're seeing, fish species shift polewards and other species trying to, and then maybe hitting geographical barriers like the island simply ends. So I think in many of the studies looking at the impacts on ecosystems and species and how much will be lost, they often just revert to temperature as the driving factor. Now, of course, there's others there, but temperature is, I think, a really, really crucial one. So by lowering temperatures, we could be sure that solar geoengineering would reduce that pressure, but it would change some others. So rainfall patterns would be different. Exactly how that pans out around the world depends and will impact different species differently. Ocean acidification is another driver of harm in the ocean, and it wouldn't do anything about that, unless, of course, it encouraged the world to emit a lot more CO2, in which case it would make it worse. And it would also have a few side effects. So stratospheric aerosol injection would make the sky a little hazier, which would have some effects. People are studying how big a deal that is. It would add to acid rain a bit, but not particularly much. And it would affect the ozone layer a bit. I don't know how much of an impact that would have, but I believe temperature would be the overwhelming driver. But as I mentioned, there's a few other factors to consider, and how that pans out regionally and on a species by species level will differ from place to place.
Great.
And could I just add to that because I actually in one of my books tried to quantify the rate at which species would have to or ecosystems would have to migrate towards the poles, and it's several meters per day, even at relatively low rates of global warming. And so slowing that down obviously allows more species to move at a rate which they're better able to move at. It's hard to move several meters a day if you're a tree. And I'm not being facetious. I mean, obviously they can spread new seeds and so on, and much easier if you're a bird or you're a very mobile species. But then when you start to fragment these ecosystems by you're pulling them apart, different things moving at different rates, then you cause all sorts of problems for biodiversity in ways which are very difficult to understand and quantify. So slowing that all of that down therefore increases, I think, the adaptive capacity of ecosystems as a whole when dealing with climate change. But of course, as Arthur said, climate is not the biggest pressure on ecosystems globally at the moment, and biodiversity loss. It's other direct human impacts, all of which we're familiar with. So this only really talks about the thermal tolerance envelopes of ecosystems and species.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Yeah,
and that brings up another thing, just briefly.
Sure.
So one of the concerns, I was sort of describing if stratospheric aerosol injection was done wisely, smoothly, over time, but were it to be done at a large scale and then suddenly stopped and permanently stopped, which, you could turn it back on again. But if that were to happen, you would get a rapid warming in the initial years after you stopped a large scale deployment. And that rapid warming could potentially be potentially substantially worse than climate change was, because that rate of change in the initial years would be particularly fast. So worth bearing that in mind.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Peter. And I just wanted to say maybe two other mechanisms that I just want to throw out there. The first that you alluded to, Peter, I just wanted to mention is that especially this question of the hazy sky, and kind of mediating the interaction between organisms and the sun. Of course, the sun is a source of life, kind of mediating that. Is going to have some effects, and we don't exactly know what those are. But that is kind of the source of a lot of questions that have just not been adequately, studied at this point. And I think there's more and more work being done on this. But I think the other second thing I just wanted to say is like an in principle point, that I think is important, although some might disagree. But we can contrast something like solar reflection methods versus carbon dioxide removal, in the sense that solar reflection methods operate on a different axis when it comes to the problem than carbon dioxide removal, which is, what is it doing? Well, the carbon is creating this effect of the forming effect, so you're drawing it down, and so you're operating on the same axis. But by operating on a different axis, I think this is a principled reason to think that there will be more novel outcomes or more uncertainty involved with the intervention than the former. So I just wanted to say that to you, because someone in the Q&A mentioned mass afforestation, which certainly is a form of geoengineering, but potentially, in my view, a little bit less objectionable, in part on these grounds. Although still raises a lot of governance questions, including where does this land coming from? And what impacts might it have? And is it a monoculture or not? There's plenty of social and political issues and ecological issues with that proposal as well.
And can I add on the termination shock issue? I think this is a real question, and that's the biggest ecological impact of all. And in my nuclear war book, I actually got to thinking that maybe termination shock was the mechanism of mass extinctions throughout the Phanerozoic, because you've got these very long CO2 inputs. This is the case at the end of the Permian, Devonian, and other major mass extinctions. And potentially on that, you've got superimposed a super volcanic, in winter, essentially. And then the temperature plunged right back down again. All those aerosols get removed quite quickly, and it goes right back up again. And that kind of roller coaster may this is speculative, but my speculation is that roller coaster effect of very rapidly changing temperatures at a global level might be a driver of mass extinction. So yes, an SRM done wrong, where we have a huge gap between the effect of carbon forcing and the reflectivity of the top of the atmosphere, and that continues to get wider and wider. Then we get termination shock. I think that would probably be worse for ecology than just unmitigated global warming.
Thank you. I've noticed in terms of, there are a number of questions about more specific ecosystems or biomes. For example, questions about what would the marine environmental impacts be, or from marine cloud brightening or SAI, in terms of what would happen when particles fall back out of the sky into the sea. There's similarly a set of questions here around the polar regions. Are there any specific considerations around how SRM would affect the polar regions, including risk for ice bears and so forth. I don't know if you want to quickly answer that one, Pete, but I would also point out we've had a live discussion on sea ice. We're going to be producing this whole theme of nature, something we're going to continue working on through the months, because it's just such a large topic. But Pete, if you wanted to add something on polar before I finish on one final kind of slightly more philosophical question.
Well, I think both in the case of the ocean and in the poles, the effects of temperature would loom all the larger than on land, because in the poles, a lot of the changes in other variables are driven by the very rapid warming we're seeing there. So the poles are warming 3 to 4 times faster than the rest of the planet, and that's driving quite a lot of the hydrological change. It would be a dominant effect versus in the subtropics and tropics, solar geoengineering would rearrange rainfall patterns somewhat, and so it may worsen things. And in the ocean, of course, rainfall doesn't make a great deal of difference. So temperature, again, would be dominant. And there was a question there about the particles dropping out. So the sulfate particles, if we were to use those to create this effect, would have a little bit of an acid rain effect. That is only really an issue on land. In the oceans, the carbon dioxide is by far the biggest contributor to the acidification of the ocean. So while acid rain is an issue on land, particularly, it is a very small contributor to ocean acidification. So yeah, both in the poles and in the ocean, the effect of temperature would loom larger, and SAI should work more effectively. Though, as I mentioned, wouldn't address ocean acidification directly.
But
Thank-
Pete, is it only sulfur which is being considered, or are there other particles in contention which are being seriously considered for deployment in SRM?
There are other potential particles. The sulfur is the one we know very well from nature and is very well studied and is effectively certain to work to some extent. Other particles, solid particles, or other candidates might reduce some side effects, but they haven't been added to the stratosphere at the millions of ton scale. So there's lots more questions and uncertainties and the potential for much bigger surprises there. So there could be particles that are preferable, and they may have lower side effects, but at the moment they are far less understood and could potentially come with surprises.
Brilliant. Well, I'm going to round up with one last question, which speaks to the title of our discussion: would solar geoengineering transform or preserve nature? The question is this: the word preserve implies a status quo, but what is the status quo in a rapidly changing planet? How do we define what the status quo is that we preserve? Mark?
Well, that's sort of been my point all the way through, is that there is no such point in time. But then there never has been, and part of the way this debate is constructed is there's this understanding that been this stable period called the Holocene, and that's when human civilization developed, and actually it has been pretty stable compared to even previous interglacials. So it is kind of unusual, but even within the Holocene, there's been little ice ages and shifts and ups and downs and so on. And we're now moving into the Anthropocene, and that's a period of instability. But it's never really the case. There's never a baseline that you'd want to say, right, that's the perfect planet, and it's the same for nature, really. Even if you look at the example, look at the Amazon rainforest. It's full of all of these remnant archaeology from Native Americans who lived in what we now think is virgin forest. And so there's no perfect baseline that we should return to, or that we could consider the ideal state of the planet. And in which case, once you've let go of that, there's two dimensions. One is that the Earth has to be self-regulating, and I think I'm probably agreeing with you, Arthur, on this to an extent, that we can't intervene at every level and micromanage the Earth system. It's too complex, and there's too many other life forms which have their own needs and their own interests in it. But at the same time, we can't just go for stasis. It's not in balance. It's never been in balance. So we have to intervene in sensible ways to enable the Earth to continue as a self-regulatory organism. It's a bit like humans. Like if you get a fever, you want to take some drug to bring down the fever, but we don't try and manage your temperature in a direct way every single second of the day, because that's not how you work as an organism. And so I think the planet is to some extent similar.
Thank you. I don't know if you want to find a word on that, Arthur, before
Yeah.
we close.
I'll just say that this is, right, what we're trying to preserve is an ethical and political question. So I completely agree with Mark that there's no perfect, or it's not a valueless objective question, right? It never has been about what we're trying to preserve. That said, there are things we're trying to preserve. So preserve is a value that that exists and we're trying to keep, right? If that's what you understand as value, as a preserve. We talk about preserving species all the time. That's very easy to understand, right? We're in a mass, a mass extinction that is largely being caused by us, and we think that's a bad thing. And so when we talk about preserving species, we mean, can we stop? Can we try to help the species that are still along? We might say that about our ecosystem, many ecosystems too, and our natural communities. It's not about holding fixed, but kind of keeping this relative stability. That may be in this kind of self-regulation that might not just operate on a global scale, but maybe at more local scales too. I don't know exactly what Mike thinks of that, but this is what I think. And this is something that we need to explore morally and philosophically, but also politically. We need to talk to one another. What do we value? And because we do value the way, things the way they are, as we should. And so we should need to talk about how to navigate change. And that's a lot of what we're doing in this conversation here.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed. Pete, do you want to just wrap up and then?
Well, I guess thanks, Mark, for guiding those questions, and to everyone who joined us. And thanks again to Mark Lynas, Arthur Obst, and Mike Tidwell for this great conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.